good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the OncoSil Medical Investor Webinar. We might have a few more people joining, but we will kick off. Everyone is on a forced mute, so Nigel will run through his presentation. And then at the conclusion, we welcome your questions in the chat box. So please submit your questions in the chat box, which is at the middle of the bottom of your screen. And then I will read out the questions and Nigel can respond accordingly. The webinar will run for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. We do welcome your questions at the end. So I'll pass the floor now to Nigel, who is the CEO and Managing Director of OncoSil Medical, and he will run through the presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Nigel.
Good morning, everybody. A pleasure to be here, and thanks for attending this webinar presentation. If most of you are like me, I think it's fair to say that we're quite disappointed in the current share price. It's not where it should be because we have nothing but good news. In fact, this is the best news we've had as a company since we've had the OncoSil device approved under CE marking. And I'll show you why later on in this presentation, why we are optimistic and why you as shareholders should be optimistic and share that optimism with us as well. So, of course, the standard disclaimer. So in terms of an executive summary, what have we done? Obviously, as everyone is aware, we're commercializing a targeted radiotherapy for pancreatic cancer. We've treated our 200th patient as of October 2024. This includes all patients treated in a clinical trial setting as well as patients that have been treated commercially. The OncoSil device is now approved for sale in over 34 countries with the CE mark. And we're expecting significant commercial ramp up in FY 2025 and beyond, because we've got new markets that we're adding, which happen to be distributor markets in the near term. As well, we see increased market penetration opportunities because we're going to expand our label by adding a new delivery method and adding a new chemotherapy combination. I'll get into the significance of these in a few slides. So we believe that what is now happening is going to enable us to accelerate market penetration because we are going to be able to significantly shorten the sales cycle and provide an increase in the addressable hospital sites within the UK and the European Union. So what we have, in our opinion, is a platform technology that we believe can be leveraged into other solid tumor cancer indications. They could be, for example, bile duct cancer, which is distal cholangiocarcinoma. It could be liver, or it could be glioblastoma. But these are all things that we're looking toward in the future. Suffice it to say that we have an experienced board and management team that have vast experience, hundreds of years, in fact, in the commercialization of radiotherapies. So what does the market look like? The market is valued at approximately $4.2 billion, and it's a market where we have no direct competitors. OncoSil has been granted breakthrough designation status in the EU, the UK, and the United States. It also comes with extensive patent coverage across all key geographies. Local pancreatic, there's a large global pancreatic cancer population of approximately 500,000 patients per year, and we're targeting 30% of that, or approximately 153,000 patients. 30%, I'll get into why that 30% is relevant. in a couple of more slides. But this market is expected to grow by approximately 37% by the year 2035. So there has been negligible survival improvement in over 20 years in pancreatic cancer. Less than 12% of patients survive at 5 years. And in fact, the median overall survival is 8.5 months, which is pretty dismal when one looks at the advances that have been made in other cancers over the past 20 years. We've also now got the first ever comparative analysis, which we released in September 2024, indicating significant benefits with the OncoSil device in combination with chemotherapy. What we see is, in terms of overall survival benefit, plus 7 months out to 20 months with the OncoSil device plus chemotherapy versus 13 months alone with chemotherapy. What else do we see? We see a more than doubling of the surgical resection rate. Surgical resection is important because it is still considered the gold standard. Surgical resection is done or performed with curative intent. We see 28.6% of those patients in combination with the OncoSil device chemotherapy versus 12.1% with chemotherapy alone. We've more than doubled the patients eligible for downstaging with the device and chemotherapy at 31 months versus 13.6 months with chemotherapy alone. Those are all very powerful statistics. If you look at just, it's a rather busy slides, but if you focus at the yellow box at the bottom, you'll see that changes in survival in the last 40 years in pancreatic cancer has barely moved the dial. So if we go over to the right side, the box in blue, we see that survival rates are very poor. 8.5 month overall, median overall survival, less than 12%, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Deaths.
Nigel, the audio just dropped out there for a minute, so you might want to repeat yourself.
Sorry. Okay. So
about 10 seconds. Yep.
Okay. So survival rates are very poor. 8.5 months median overall survival in pancreatic cancer. Less than 12% of patients survive 5 years. It's got the lowest survival rate than any other cancer. And the number of cases and deaths are both estimated to increase by 40% before the year 2035. So I want to focus your attention here on the middle box in blue. Locally advanced pancreatic cancer represents 30% of all cancer patients at the stage that they're diagnosed at. Surgical resection is the only potential curative treatment for pancreatic cancer. So at the time of diagnosis, 15% of patients, approximately 15%, are considered resectable. These patients have an overall, a median overall survival of 19 months. Our goal is to take patients in the middle box at 30% and move them over to the left-hand side. So you see the blue arrows pointing to the left. We want to get as many of those patients downstage to potentially curative resection following the administration of the OncoSil device. Why? Because these patients have a median overall survival of approximately 13 months. If one looks at the right-hand side of this, these patients have a rather dismal prognosis. 55% of these patients are already presenting with metastases at the time of diagnosis. So a little bit of OncoSil device 101. So what we're intending to do with the device is increase resection rates, increase downstaging, and therefore increase survival benefits and quality of life in these patients that we are able to treat. So the OncoSil device is intended for the treatment of locally advanced pancreatic, unresectable pancreatic cancer, which is commonly known as LAPC, in combination with gemcitabine-based chemotherapy. And we have a trial running, which is in combination with FOLFIRINOX. It's a single-use device. It's considered brachytherapy, and it's comprised of microparticles embedded when put into the reactor with phosphorus 32 and a diluent. The product has a 14-day half-life. So what you've got here is a tapering of radiation over a period of 81 days, where 98% of all the radiation is delivered, thereby providing a killing mechanism for malignant cancer cells with no damage to surrounding tissue. This is important because we are known as internal radiation. We're irradiating from the inside out versus external beam radiation or stereotactic body radiation, where we have a radioactive beam coming through to reach the pancreatic tumor. And what happens there is that there is concurrent damage to surrounding organs or tissue. The beauty of the OncoSil device is that we don't touch anything else. We have a short penetration. We're not touching other organs. We're not providing radiation damage to other organs. Currently, we're being administered under endoscopic ultrasound guidance via an injection. The patient does have to undergo general anesthesia. So what are we doing? What's the significance of this blue arrow showing the box to the red? So we are doing a trial in percutaneous delivery of the device. We believe this to be transformational for our business, as we believe it will it's highly significant in our ability to accelerate market penetration. And why is that? I'm sorry, okay. Why is that? Simply because it expands the number of clinicians to include interventional radiologists that will be able to deliver the treatment. It provides broader patient access and points of care. It means that it's an outpatient day procedure. The procedure takes approximately 20 minutes. Currently, using endoscopic ultrasound, it takes between 1.5 to 1 hour and 45 minutes to complete the treatment. The patient is under conscious sedation doing this percutaneously, which means they're awake. They can follow the instructions of the physician. This is done under CT guidance. There may be a time when the physician will tell the patient, hold your breath for 30 seconds. I'll tell you when you can start breathing again. You can't do this when you're doing this under endoscopic ultrasound because the patient is completely comatose. So the PancaSil study, which I'll get to in a minute, is anticipated to complete in Q1 calendar year 2025. We'll have a top-line readout we expect by Q2 in calendar year 2025, and we're targeting to have regulatory approval here to allow interventional radiologists to administer the treatment by Q3 in calendar year 2025. Now, this slide deck is available online, so I'm not going to go into everything that is listed here on the left-hand side of the slide. Excuse me, but I'd like to focus your attention to the information in the blue box. I've already mentioned in a previous slide, what's the significance here? We're taking the increased survival benefit, we're showing 7 months. So with chemotherapy, it's 13.3 months. With the OncoSil device plus chemotherapy, it's 20 months. Very significant. This is statistically significant information. What else are we showing here? So OncoSil, again, plus standard of care chemotherapy. Again, let's focus on the information in the blue box. More than doubled the number of surgically resected patients, 12 months with chemotherapy alone versus 28.6 months with chemotherapy plus the OncoSil device. When we look at downstaging, and if you remember back to the other slide where I pointed out the middle box, where we had 30% representing unresectable, locally advanced pancreatic cancer patients, and our intent was to downstage them, so to move them over to the left, where we can downstage those patients. 13.6% in this particular group were downstage with chemotherapy alone versus 31.4%. So we've more than doubled the number of patients that we can potentially convert to curative resection. This slide depicts where we're active. It's a little bit busy, but I can tell you that the number for Spain is now at 13. The number for Italy, the green number, is now at 2. We've just kicked off one of the most important cancer centers in Italy, and certainly one of the most important cancer centers in Europe, which is the National Cancer Hospital in Milan, Italy, under the guidance, the program is under the guidance of a very well-known and respected HPB surgeon by the name of Professor Vincenzo Mazzaferro, and he will be leading the program there. So we're very excited to get this formidable institution started, and we believe that this will be the catalyst to moving things further forward in this market. Again, let's look at what the commercial opportunity represents. Everything on the left box, where we look at existing priority markets, is valued currently at US $588 million. If we go to the lower half on the left side, and you add that in, that expands out to nearly $1 billion US. That's the addressable market available to us over the next 18 to 24 months. Market penetration here is expected to now accelerate over the medium term, driven by MDR approval, and I'll get into what MDR approval means. This means that it lifts any post-marketing restrictions in the European Union and the UK. And furthermore, we also see increased market penetration by having percutaneous delivery on our label toward the end of calendar year 2025. So what does MDR mean? So what this means for us is we're eliminating barriers to hospital adoption. This was never articulated before my time, but our label meant that we were approved in combination with something known as OSPREY, which is a post-market registry in Europe and the United Kingdom, which added several levels of complexity prior to a hospital gaining authorization to be able to use the treatment. This meant that the onboarding of hospitals could take 6 months on average, and sometimes up to 1 year to get clearance or permission to use the OncoSil device. Why? Because the hospitals needed to acquire the approval of their local ethics committee to enable them to use the technology. It also meant increased expenses for us as a company because we had to pay for every hospital that wished to submit to their ethics committee for approval. And it also meant
Nigel, the audio is just cut out again.
inclusion of that data. So what
Nigel,
are the...
sorry, Nigel,
sorry.
it's Julia here. The audio just cut out again. Could you kindly repeat what you just said? Thank you.
Starting where?
Perhaps 10 seconds ago. Thank you.
Okay, so the company needed to incur costs for ethics committee applications, and that could be anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 euros per hospital. The company also needed to pay for each and every patient that consented to have their data included in the registry. And that was anywhere from 2,700 to 3,000 euros a patient. We agreed with the regulator several years ago, under a prior administration, to include 500 patients in the registry. We don't need 500 patients to prove that this product is safe. We've already demonstrated the safety profile of the product. So what do the incoming changes mean? It means we now have the UK conformity assessment certificate. The post-market restriction has been lifted. We no longer need the Osprey registry. So that goes away. We now have a draft certificate from our regulatory body for the European Union. We expect at any day to receive the full MDR certificate, which means that the registry goes away as well. We have the draft certificate, which indicates that it does go away. So we will save money as a company, around 2 million euros over a period of 3 years, which is about 1.1 million Australian dollars per year for the next 3 years. But more importantly, it removes the administrative burden on the company for ethics approval. And it means now that we only need to ensure that the hospital has a license for phosphorus 32 or P32, as you see there on the slide. That's all we need for the hospital. We train them and we're ready to go. So we save several months, at least 6 months, and in some cases, as much as 12 months to be able to get a hospital to commercialization. This is very, very significant. So what does this all mean in terms of accelerating commercialization? So really what we have here is enhanced market access in existing and new geographies. The OncoSil trial, which we talked about, is the administration of the device percutaneously under CT guidance. What are the key milestones? We are just now at 70% recruited, so that's 14 of 20 patients. We targeted the study completion now for the Q1 2025. In fact, we hope it will be done in January, and we will do, we're targeting regulatory submission in Q2 2025, and we hope that we will have this added to the label pending regulatory approval in the second half of 2025. So what's the impact here? It will accelerate market penetration, and there are lower barriers to adoption, because in many cases, and we expect probably 50 to 60% of the European hospitals will use this to deliver the technology percutaneously via interventional radiology. And if we look at the two leading technologies in the market today that are in the space of treating liver disease, Sursphere and TheraSphere, they're being delivered by interventional radiology. And in fact, it was interventional radiology that put both of these technologies on the map. Today, these two technologies have a sales turnover of about 750 million US dollars per annum. The TRIP study, what's the significance of this? Currently, we are approved with gemcitabine-based chemotherapy. The TRIP study allows us to put FOLFIRINOX, which is the backbone chemotherapy. It's much less expensive. It's the backbone chemotherapy in Europe. And this will allow us to get this into the treatment guidelines. And again, it will help to accelerate market penetration simply because cost is not an issue here. Our targeted regulatory submission is in calendar year Q3, Q4 calendar year 2025. We anticipate that it will be added to the label in the first half of calendar year 2026. And lastly, what are we doing in bile duct cancer? Bile duct cancer or distal cholangiocarcinoma. This is where we are focusing on the US market with our HDE submission. We are in ongoing discussions. We remain in ongoing discussions, and which I want to point out are very constructive with the US FDA. We're preparing additional data to support questions that the agency would like us to address. We realize that distal cholangiocarcinoma is a relatively small addressable market, but that's not the issue here. The issue here is that it is the fastest and most expeditious way for entry into the US market that will eventually lead us to get approval for LAPC with a pivotal trial in the future. So further accelerating commercialization, what is the significance of the GBA coverage with evidence development trial in Germany? It's important to point out that Germany represents, irrespective of what device you've got, 50 to 55% of all turnover of medical devices in Europe. It's the biggest market. It will remain the biggest market and the most important from a commercialization opportunity. The GBA has just approved the OncoSil device to move ahead with a coverage with evidence development study, which is fully funded through the GBA and the Ministry of Health in Germany. In fact, it's a revenue positive trial because the doses that are used in the control arm, which means to say in the arm of the study, it will be a randomized trial. So in the arm of the study that takes the OncoSil device plus the chemotherapy, the doses that are used, the OncoSil doses that are used, are paid for. The rest of the study is also paid for and funded through the GBA. We received this approval in October of 2024. The next step, and they have 2 months to do this, the next step is for the Ministry of Health to sign off. There isn't an example where they have not signed off on this. And I also want to point out that this is the very first oncologic study that has been approved by the GBA for a coverage with evidence development study. So What does this mean commercially? The impact here is that because this trial has been approved to move forward, this opens the door for German hospitals that have applied for this innovation funding program known as NUB. I won't give you the long German name because it's, even as somebody that does speak a little bit of German or enough German, it's a long name that I won't bore you with. But what this does mean is that it allows the hospitals that have applied, and we currently sit at 84 hospitals, by the way. I'm not telling you that all 84 hospitals will be able to do this treatment because they won't. They won't all have the necessary infrastructure, but those that do can apply to the public health insurances for a specified number of doses for patients that will be treated outside of the trial. In other words, these are patients that will be treated clinically, and they will be reimbursed. They will apply for a specified number on an annual basis, and they resubmit for these numbers every year from this point forward. So looking at the bottom of this slide, if you take the top 10 German pancreatic cancer centers, the top 10 performed nearly 2,000 complex pancreatic surgeries in 2023. These are primary targets for not only the GBA study, but also for commercial adoption in addition to others. What does this mean when I say 2,000 complex surgeries? That means that if we go back to the slide where we talked about 15% of patients being undergoing resection at the time of diagnosis, that's where this 2,000 comes into play. So 2,000 of the patients in Germany that were diagnosed by these top 10 centers went on to have surgical resection or complex surgeries. What about the other 30%, which is our target population? So the 30%, in actual fact, represents a population of 4,000 patients. And our intent is to move some of those patients to the left-hand side of that slide, if you remember when we just talked about it a few minutes ago. So that is where we intend to go in Germany. The significance of OncoSil. This is a novel delivery method. We see greater market access and adoption with interventional radiology. Why? Because this group is used to working with radiation. They have several advantages. In many cases, it may be geographic specific or hospital specific, but this medical specialty is very much a part of the patient treatment pathway. A lot of these patients are selected at a tumor board. The interventional radiologist or interventional oncologist, as some of them like to be known, have a seat at the tumor board where they're consulted on what they can do with a particular patient. So in this case, we believe that they will have an integral part in how these patients are treated. So we expect the impact here commercially on the use of the device. And what's the outlook look like? So if we look at upside commercial ramp up from new market initiatives, that would be doing this percutaneously, getting FOLFIRINOX on our label in Europe. The target market, we have an aspirational target of between 5 and 10% market penetration out to calendar year 2029 in existing and near-term markets That implies up to 4,700 units per annum. If we look at the right-hand side of the slide in the blue box, a market penetration of 5% translates into approximately $57 million US. 10% is 115 million US dollars. So the upside potential here is very, very significant. What are the significant catalysts over the next 24 months? Well, we need top-line study, data in the landmark PanCASIL trial, finalization of the GBA trial. We're also looking into something called Forfait Innovation in France, which is another mechanism for us to get into the French market. And it's a market we should not ignore because it's the second biggest market in Europe. What does MDR approval mean? MDR approval gives us the opportunity to take that exact file and submit to the TGA here in Australia for regulatory approval. It's important because I find it rather perverse that as an Australian company, we don't have this technology available and approved in our home market. What happens is that once the submission is made in Australia, we either receive an answer back in 4 weeks. If we are not selected for a random audit, if we are selected for a random audit, then that approval takes approximately 6 months before we get TGA approval. But the most important thing is that the TGA have expressly stated that an MDR filing that has been approved in the European Union can be submitted to the TGA for approval. And then, of course, we will work on other high value markets. We are now engaged in markets in the Middle East where the cost is not so much of an issue. So places like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, so Dubai, Oman, those are markets where cost is not an issue and the product will be fully reimbursed. Thank you. I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Nigel. Okay, so question number 1 from Justin. What is the expected timeline for each step of the sales process? E.g., 1, ethics approval, time after first procedure until second procedure is done, e.g., 2 to 3 months question. Expected time after first procedure until OncoSil is used on a regular basis, and expected annual uses for each site and physician.
Well, first of all, let's deal with the last part. Every site is different. So we're targeting high volume centers. If it's a center that says we do 5 treatments a year, we can do 5 treatments a year. It's really not in our best interest to spend the money training that center because the rate of return is not very attractive. And the more procedures you do, the more proficient you become, the better at it you get. Yeah. So I think the first part of the question related to ethics approval. We're no longer going to need ethics approval. So in terms of what that would mean. So right now, ethics approval can take 6 months, right? Until we get this burden lifted from our shoulders. All of the hospitals that we have on board to date needed to undergo ethics, and that was anywhere, as I stated, from 6 to 12 months. Patients have to, whether it's with ethics or without ethics approval, patients have to undergo an induction chemotherapy of gemcitabine-based chemo, which generally takes 1 month, and then the patients can undergo treatment with the OncoSil device. So they're under induction chemotherapy first, Why? Because the chemotherapy actually enhances chemotherapy, especially gemcitabine, is known as a radiosensitizer. So it makes the chemotherapy more effective. So let's assume now that the burden is lifted in terms of requiring ethics approval. We make sure the site has a P32 license. They have enough license to bring in the dose, to bring in more than just one dose every month, because residual or leftover radiation also counts against your license. So we work with the sites to make sure they have sufficient headroom on their license. Look, it's been my experience. I've had the privilege of launching both Yttrium-90 technologies. Once a hospital treats their first patient, you want to, first of all, make sure that the patient that they're choosing when they're coming out of the gate is a suitable patient, and that the patient is expected to have a good result. Why? Because inevitably, within any institution, you've got people sitting on the fence. Those that are sitting on the fence, if the procedure turns out to be poor, the patient outcome is poor, they jump to one side of the fence and say, see, I told you so. We should have never brought this in. The patient does well. The oncologist is excited. The surgeon's excited. The whole team is on board at that point. So it's very important in terms of patient selection in the early going to make sure you're not going to select patients that are not going to benefit from the device. So to answer the question, how much time is between patient 1 and patient 2, it could be as long as 2 months. It could be as long as 3 months, because they want to evaluate to see how that first patient is doing. If there are any safety concerns, would they do something differently in terms of where they position the needle? There could be technical reasons that they wait. But generally speaking, it's to see how they manage that patient. And when they bring that patient back at 8 weeks, how is that patient looking? What's happened? Has the tumor shrunk? Has that patient improved? Has the patient's condition, are they having fewer side effects than they had when they were strictly under chemotherapy? I hope that answers the question sufficiently.
Thanks, Nigel. So Craig has got a question here. Can you elaborate on the data required by the FDA for CCA?
For DCCA, so this is a humanitarian device exemption application. The data required is related to benefit versus risk. I can't give you specifics. I know the questions, but I'm sorry, I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics on what the questions are. There are 4 questions that we need to answer. Ironically, some of which we've answered back in 2016, which predates me significantly by 4 years. So somewhere along the line, somebody has come back and asked the same question. We have to answer it. We'll answer it in a respectful way, because we're dealing with an agency that obviously has had some staff turnover as well. So we're confident that we can answer these questions. But the data under an HDE paradigm is that we are required to prove safety and probable benefit, which we believe we do. Thanks.
Thank you, Nigel. And Robert has a question here. Hindsight never wrong. Was the cap raise underpriced? Should it have come after positive news flow from Europe rather than all linked?
Well, there is a requirement when you're doing a capital raise. There is a requirement for a higher standard of disclosure. And this news came in the middle of the capital raise, which meant that we couldn't wait. We would have probably have put ourselves in a very precarious position with the ASX had we waited and not disclosed this information.
Thanks,
I
Nigel.
think that's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you so much. And there's a few in the chat box as well. Nigel, can you see these questions on the screen?
No, I cannot.
Okay, I'll read. This one's quite long from Scott. Hi, Nigel. My 3 questions are as follows. Nigel, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read out one question. You can
Let's
then
go one at a time, please. Right.
Yeah, he's got 3 quite lengthy questions here. Hi, Nigel. You may have heard that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was today announced as the Secretary for Health and Human Services under the incoming Trump administration. So with Robert Kennedy Jr.'s clear views on major reform being necessary in the whole USA medical sector and being responsible for by far the largest budget item of almost US $2 trillion per year, how may this affect OSL's opportunities in the US? That's a very good question, very topical.
Yes, thanks, Scott. That is a very topical question and very current. In all honesty, this is a disease with an enormous unmet medical need. I mean, let's talk about all the, let's ignore all his posture about removing fluoride from the water, which I don't know how important that is. I mean, we're talking about people's lives here. Fluoride doesn't affect people's lives in drinking water. The dial has not moved in this indication in 40 years. In fact, in many countries, it's the single biggest killer. In the United States, pancreatic cancer is significantly on the rise, and there are several reasons for that. It's alcohol, it's poor diet, it's obesity. So those are things that perhaps Mr. Kennedy will be able to tackle as well. But suffice it to say, I don't see that this will impact us at all. Second part of the second question, Julia?
Absolutely. Yes. So 3.332 billion shares on issue, plus a large number of options, which will be increased with the current capital raising, coming just circa 7 months since the last one. That's a lot of paper for a company with a 40 million market cap. How do you plan on addressing this going forward?
Well, look, I think it is, I agree, it's a lot for a company with a market cap of 40 million. Look, I firmly believe we shouldn't be sitting where we are today. Our market cap should be twice what it is. We should be sitting at 1.8 or 2 cents based on the news that we've released during the capital raise. And frankly, I'm at a loss to understand why we are where we are and why we're not at 2 cents. So look, I think we have the ability to grow the business significantly. I hope I've convinced you that there is significant upside and that you share the enthusiasm of the OncoSil team, and particularly the OncoSil commercial team going forward. So I'm not overly concerned that our market cap is at 40 million. I believe we have the ability to significantly increase it.
Thank you, Nigel. And then one last question from Scott. In the current raising, the company has also secured a commitment from an institution for any shortfall securities arising from the share purchase plan. Are you able to advise if this institution is Pengana Capital?
I cannot tell you who that is, unfortunately.
Yes, I suspected so. Thank you so much, Scott. Does anyone else have, do we have more questions? Okay, no, we've addressed all the questions. Does anyone else have any questions? We've had a nice, thank you, Scott. Thank you for your questions. Anyone else have any questions?
Well, I would like to thank everybody for their questions. I thank you for listening. We are truly at an inflection point for the company. There's nowhere to go but up. You've seen the data. You've seen the accomplishments. And these are all significant milestones that we outlined 2 years ago. We've ticked some of those boxes. We still have the FDA box to tick. But I think this provides us with enough of a footprint to jump off. This is our springboard. This is a jump off point for commercialization. So we're looking forward to the coming years ahead. We believe that the OncoSil device will make a difference in this patient population. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Have a beautiful day.